I want to continue in Matthew chapter 24 and talk about the first few verses where Jesus is answering the question that the disciples asked. And a lot of people claim that these are three distinct questions dealing with three distinct and separate things from one another. Let's look at these verses carefully and let's determine what the Bible is actually trying to say. In Matthew 24 and 1, as we noted last time, he was just talking about the destruction of Jerusalem and unprecedented judgment that would come upon that generation contrasted from their ancestors, showing us that the word generation is not talking about Israel as a race, and showing them that the disciples were so overwhelmed by this that they showed him the buildings of the temple. Now, if you cut off chapter 23 of Matthew from chapter 24, you're going to wonder why they showed him the buildings of the temple. And you're going to disconnect the context from chapter 23. But clearly, when you read chapter 23 through chapter 24, remembering that it was only people centuries later that added chapters and verses, that this was all meant to be read in a sequence without breaking it up, you find out that what he had to say in chapter 23 is everything to do with what chapter 24 was all about. And so that's why they showed him the buildings of the temple. He had just said their house was going to be left desolate, judgment would come upon them, and that had never been done before. By the way, when you get judgment that's stretching from Abel's death, Adam and Eve's son, right until Zacharias, son of Barachias, was slain between the altar and the temple and so forth, that's judgment that's going to come, such as was not in the past nor ever shall be. This is another indication that Matthew 24 is not dealing with our day or our future. It's dealing with the people that he spoke to in that generation. And so when Jesus was referred to the temple by the disciples, he said, did you see all these things? Now notice the terminology. These things. He's referring to the temple buildings. And he said, verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. And then, as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy coming? Second question. And of the end of the world? Third. So these things is clearly referring to the temple destruction. Now, most prophecy teachers, no matter what their slant on prophecy is, believe that was talking about the temple destruction. When is the temple going to be destroyed? And all of them agree it was AD 70 that was fulfilled in, when that temple was leveled down, razed to the ground, and it was utterly destroyed. But when it says, what shall be the sign of thy coming, they think that's a different subject altogether, and of the end of the world. So they say he's talking about three different things, and so part of it, yes, is the temple destruction, but the rest of the questions deal with our day or our future. Well, I'm going to prove to you that's not the case, because the sign that he was referred to by the disciples in the form of a question was what started this whole dialogue of Matthew chapter 24 out. The sign of thy coming. The context was, when shall these things, the temple destruction, the buildings of the temple, when's that going to be destroyed? And what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? And when you go to Mark talked about the same conversation using slightly different words. And that's so beneficial to us when we study these gospel accounts, because it clarifies and narrows down exactly what was being spoken about. And this is a perfect example. By doing this, comparing what Mark wrote about the same discussion, you find out it can't be talking about our day. In Mark 13, here we read it again. As he went out of the temple, one of his disciples said unto him, Master, see what manner of stones and what buildings are here. And Jesus answering said unto them, seest thou these great buildings? There shall not be left one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. So far, so good. Same. And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives over against the temple, Peter and James and John and Andrew asked him privately, tell us, when shall these things be? See, he's using the same terminology. And earlier in verse 2, he talked about these great buildings. In Matthew, it said these things. Now, these great buildings. So, when shall these things be? And here's the kicker. What shall be the sign when these things shall be fulfilled? So clearly, in Mark, these things that everybody agrees is referring to the temple and the destruction of the temple is also what the sign is all about. The sign when all these things shall be fulfilled. So, in other words, if Matthew said the sign of thy coming, and to all of his recollection that he could remember, the sign of the coming was how he thought Jesus was speaking. And then Mark, he remembered, and he wrote the sign when these things shall be fulfilled. He didn't say sign of thy coming. He said the sign when all these things shall be fulfilled. Now, it's utterly ridiculous to think that Mark is talking about a completely different sign asked by the disciples of Jesus than what Matthew was asking about. They're obviously talking about the same single sign. And Matthew and Mark put it all together, narrow it down, and you realize that the sign of his coming was the sign when the temple would be destroyed. In other words, Jesus would come when the temple would be destroyed. When they would see the temple destruction, that would let them know this was a coming of Jesus. Now, that doesn't mean Jesus has to be visible. By the way, the word coming is parousia in Greek. Parousia is presence. It's the sign of your presence. It's the sign that you are King of Kings and your kingdom is permeating this whole region. And what's going to be the sign of that? In other words, this is what they thought of it as talking about. What's the sign of your coming? What's the sign when these things shall be fulfilled? And then go to Luke. And Luke 21 has the same discussion again. And you have to go down to several verses. And it talks about in verse 5, some of them spake of the temple and how it was adorned with goodly stones and gifts. And he said, as for these things which you behold, the days will come in the which there shall not be left one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. And then they asked him, and here it is again, Master, but when shall these things be? Again, he refers in verse 6 to these things which you behold, talking about the temple. Everybody agrees. And the disciples use his same terminology. Well, when shall these things be? When is the temple going to go down? And once more, what sign will there be when these things shall come to pass? So Matthew uses the sign of thy coming, but both Mark and Luke change the wording and recollect it as being the signs when these things shall come to pass. Their recollection was Jesus was talking about the temple being destroyed. Now, Matthew wasn't talking about a different sign than they were, and they weren't talking about two different conversations. Matthew understood, and Mark and Luke understood that when Jesus would come, the temple would be destroyed. And so by comparing the gospel accounts, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21, comparing their words and the way that they remembered what was said, we understand that they knew the coming of the Lord in this context was something that would happen in their generation, and it would involve the temple destruction. And that really comes to the forefront, as I mentioned earlier in previous lessons, Matthew 21 and verse 40, where Jesus had just given a parable of the vineyard and the wicked husbandman, and how that they would beat the servants and kill some of them, symbolizing the prophets that God sent to Israel. Jerusalem was this vineyard. In fact, Isaiah even calls Jerusalem a vineyard. And then he sends his son, and they said, this is the heir. Come, let's kill him, and let's seize on his inheritance. And they caught him, cast him out of the vineyard, and slew him, just like they took Jesus out of Jerusalem and crucified him. And when the Lord, therefore, of the vineyard cometh, notice the words Jesus is using, the coming of the Lord. What will he do to those husbandmen? And they said, he will miserably destroy those wicked men, let out his vineyard to other husbandmen, which shall render him the fruits in their seasons. And then he clearly lets them know He's talking about them, which is what verse 45 is speaking about. Now, nobody that understands the Bible in any manner at all will say that the coming of the Lord in Matthew 21 and 40 is in our future. Even the Pharisees that heard him knew he was talking about them in their day. And you know, when you go back before Matthew 24, and they're referring to the destruction of the temple as the coming of the Lord, that's all he mentioned to them about his coming, quote unquote. Because before chapter 24, look for every reference to the coming of the Lord. And you're not going to find one of them refer to the resurrection, some people call the rapture, that you and I are still looking for. Before Matthew 24, they somehow understood a saying of his about the coming of the Lord, his coming. And the only coming you can find that gave them any sense to even use that term is about the temple destruction and sending wrath on Jerusalem. That's chapter 21. Go back to Matthew 16 and go to the end of the chapter. And he says, verily I say unto you in verse 28, there be some standing here which shall not taste of death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. In other words, you won't die. Some of you standing here won't die before you see the Son of Man coming. Now that has to be in their lifetime. They wouldn't die. But then you go back to Matthew 10 even further, and let's talk about the coming of the Lord there. He's telling them to go out, heal the sick, cleanse the lepers, raise the dead, cast out devils, freely receive, freely give. Don't provide gold, silver, brass in your purses, and so forth. And he said, I'm going to send you as sheep in the midst of wolves. And he starts saying some things that are in Matthew 24 as well. When they deliver you up, take no thought what you shall speak, for it shall be given you in that same hour what you shall speak. And then in verse 23, but when they persecute you, and this is all I've heard preachers try to say, no, he was just talking about coming to them like he promised he would meet up with them again. No, the context is saying the same thing as Matthew 24. They're going to persecute you in this city, so flee to another. For verily I say unto you, you shall not have gone over the cities of Israel till the Son of Man be come. Now, not only did he tell them in Matthew 16, some of you are still going to be alive when I come. Now he's telling the disciples, you won't have gone over all the cities of Israel till the Son of Man be come. In other words, they'd still be alive too. So this is the only reference to the coming of Jesus in Matthew before chapter 24 that gave the disciples any understanding whatsoever about his coming. And it had to do within their lifetime. Don't let somebody take Matthew 24 and don't let them tell you there are three different questions with three completely different answers. They're all questions about the same thing. The coming that would happen in their day, and Matthew 23 really drove it out of the park when Jesus said, I would have gathered you people as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you would not. Your house is left unto you desolate. And it blows the disciples' minds. And they say, my God, this is going to happen in our day. Jesus, when is going to be the sign? They weren't the least bit interested in what would happen thousands of years later. They were interested in what Jesus just spoke about. Matthew 24 is already fulfilled and has been fulfilled for 2,000 years.